Every single time you grab that heavy nozzle at the gas pump, swipe your card, and fill up your tank, you are making a massive, totally invisible bet. You think you are just buying regular unleaded. You think the only thing you actually have to worry about is whether the price per gallon went up another 10 cents since yesterday morning. But you are completely ignoring a silent, violent chemical reaction that is actively happening directly under your feet at that exact station. Right now, as we speak, there is a hidden chemical imbalance heavily destroying fuel systems across the entire country. Cars are rolling into my shop on heavy tow trucks, barely running, shaking violently at an idle, and the owners are completely clueless. They assume they have a massive mechanical failure. They think their engine block just randomly gave up on them. And the absolute worst part about this is that nobody at the dealership or the massive auto parts chains is telling you the truth about the fluid you are actively pumping into your car. The massive problem silently destroying these motors isn't bad fuel in the traditional sense you're thinking of. You aren't getting a tank full of raw dirt or heavy sand. You are pumping fuel that used to be perfectly good, but completely changed its physical and chemical structure after sitting stagnant in a massive underground storage tank. Before we completely tear open the exact chemical nightmare happening inside your gas tank right now, and I show you the totally invisible warning signs that your engine is actively suffocating on contaminated liquid, drop a quick comment down below. Tell me exactly what city or state you are watching from today, and tell me exactly what specific car you are driving. I'm always looking at the totally different climates you guys are actively dealing with. A guy fighting massive, suffocating humidity down in Florida is dealing with a completely different fuel equation than a guy driving his truck in the bone-dry heat of an Arizona summer. The local climate entirely dictates exactly how fast this chemical breakdown physically happens. And if you actually appreciate getting the raw, unfiltered truth straight from the shop floor instead of the generic, heavily polished sales pitch the service writers feed you, do me a massive favor and hit that like button, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. It tells me you guys want real garage knowledge, and it keeps me actively pulling the curtain back on the totally invisible stuff that heavily drains your wallet. Let's get straight into the absolute reality of what modern gasoline actually is. When you pump gas today, you are not buying the pure, highly stable liquid gasoline your grandfather put in his heavy steel V8 50 years ago. You are buying a highly engineered, heavily compromised chemical blend designed specifically to satisfy strict federal emissions regulations and corporate efficiency targets. Almost every single drop of fuel pumped in this country contains a heavy dose of ethanol. Usually, it is sitting right around 10%. Sometimes pushed up to 15. And ethanol possesses one highly specific, absolutely terrifying physical property that changes the entire mechanical reality of your powertrain. It is violently hygroscopic. That is a strict chemical term, meaning it actively, aggressively pulls raw moisture directly out of the ambient air. It acts exactly like a heavy liquid sponge sitting directly inside your gas tank. This means the fuel sitting in the massive underground tanks at your local gas station is no longer a highly stable, reliable product over an extended period of time. It is literally on a ticking clock the absolute second the heavy delivery truck drops it off. Look at how a gas station physically operates. Those massive underground tanks have thick vent pipes sticking out of the concrete to allow the heavy fluid to efficiently flow out of the pumps. Every single time the ambient temperature totally drops in the dead of night and violently spikes during the heat of the day, the trapped air inside that underground tank aggressively expands and contracts. It constantly pulls heavy, heavily humid air straight from the outside environment directly into the dark tank. The raw moisture from that humid air instantly condenses on the cold metal and fiberglass walls of the heavy storage tank. It turns into actual, physical drops of heavy liquid water, and the ethanol sitting entirely inside the gasoline blend aggressively absorbs every single drop of that water. At first, the heavily treated fuel seems perfectly fine. The ethanol chemically holds the water in total suspension. You pump it into your car, the engine physically burns it, and you have absolutely no idea anything is totally wrong. But there is a massive, highly destructive threshold that you cannot physically see from the driver's seat. Once the ethanol absorbs too much water, once that critical physical limit is completely crossed, the entire chemical structure of the fuel violently collapses. Mechanics call this phase separation, and it is an absolute mechanical death sentence for your highly sensitive fuel injectors. The heavy ethanol completely breaks its chemical bond with the liquid gasoline. It grabs aggressively onto the water, completely separates from the blend, and violently drops directly to the absolute bottom of the storage tank because it physically weighs heavily more than the raw gasoline. Now, instead of a perfectly mixed, highly stable fuel, you have a massive underground tank completely split into highly destructive layers. Sitting directly at the bottom is a thick, highly corrosive, heavily acidic mixture of raw water and ethanol. Sitting right above that is a completely weakened, totally degraded layer of raw gasoline that has entirely lost its high-octane rating because the ethanol was violently stripped right out of it. And when you pull up to the pump and quickly swipe your credit card, the heavy electric pump inside that underground tank reaches right down to the absolute bottom. It physically sucks up that highly corrosive water-ethanol mixture and aggressively blasts it straight into your plastic gas tank. Most drivers have a totally terrifying, highly expensive habit of completely ignoring early warning signs. They operate under a totally flawed mechanical assumption. They think, well, the car started up this morning, and it's physically driving down the highway, so the fuel must be perfectly fine. That is a massive mechanical trap. The heavy damage actively happening under your hood from phase-separated fuel doesn't usually happen in one explosive, violent event. You don't just put the car in drive and immediately snap a heavy connecting rod in half. You slowly, silently murder your entire fuel system over the course of 3 weeks. The highly corrosive liquid is aggressively attacking the soft rubber seals heavily buried inside your fuel lines. It is actively creating heavy, microscopic rust directly inside the tight tolerances of your high-pressure fuel pump. It is violently baking a hard, heavily restrictive crust onto the microscopic pintles of your expensive fuel injectors. If you are driving a modern vehicle with gasoline direct injection, this totally invisible problem is heavily magnified. Direct injection systems don't just softly spray fuel into the intake manifold like the old, sloppy engines from 30 years ago. They violently force liquid gasoline straight into the heavily pressurized combustion chamber at thousands of pounds per square inch. The secondary high-pressure fuel pump, bolted directly to your heavy aluminum cylinder head, relies entirely on the raw, liquid gasoline to physically lubricate its heavy internal metal plungers. When you unknowingly feed that pump a heavily separated, waterlogged ethanol mixture, you instantly strip away its physical hydrodynamic lubrication. The heavy metal plunger violently scores itself against the housing. It aggressively sheds microscopic metal shavings directly into your high-pressure fuel rails, completely plugging the microscopic laser-cut holes in your direct injectors. You are taking a totally silent, invisible problem at the gas pump and actively turning it into a catastrophic $4,000 fuel system replacement entirely because the heavy machine was forced to physically digest a heavily corrosive acid instead of a highly refined lubricant. By the time your dashboard actually lights up and starts screaming at you with bright orange warning lights, the heavy mechanical damage is totally done. You aren't just dealing with a bad tank of gas anymore. You are dealing with sudden, violent hesitation when you try to aggressively merge onto the interstate. You step heavily on the gas pedal, and the engine just falls completely flat on its face. You get a heavy, rough vibration shaking the steering wheel when you sit at a basic red light. You get totally random misfire codes that pop up aggressively on Tuesday and completely disappear by Thursday, driving you absolutely crazy trying to diagnose it. If you are running a modern, turbocharged engine, that totally weakened, low-octane gasoline layer you pumped is actively causing massive, highly destructive knock events inside your heavy steel cylinders. The combustion chamber temperatures absolutely skyrocket, and the computer violently pulls engine timing to aggressively keep the block from completely melting down. You just turned a highly efficient, heavily powerful piece of machinery into a sluggish, gas-guzzling nightmare purely because you completely ignored the invisible chemical breakdown actively happening right under the concrete at the gas station. Let's talk about the exact physical reality of what happens when that highly degraded, completely separated fuel actually hits the hot metal of a modern engine block. Because I see guys completely misdiagnosing this massive problem in their own driveways every single week. They pull a cheap digital code scanner out of their glove box, see a random misfire code on cylinder 3, and immediately throw a $100 ignition coil and a brand new set of expensive spark plugs at the motor. They clear the dashboard code, confidently drive down the street, and the heavy, violent vibration comes aggressively right back before they even hit the highway. They are totally blind to the fact that their fuel pressure is violently collapsing because the electric pump is trying to physically push heavy, separated water through a microscopic paper filter. I had a guy drag a 2019 Audi A4 into my bay on a flatbed tow truck just last month. Beautiful car. It had a 2-liter turbocharged engine, direct injection, a highly engineered, heavily complex piece of modern German machinery. He told me he just filled up his entire tank at his completely normal, everyday station on the corner, drove maybe 30 miles down the interstate, and the car completely fell on its face. He experienced a total, violent loss of forward power. The check engine light started violently flashing on the dash. He was totally terrified that the expensive turbocharger had completely blown up and sent heavy metal shrapnel straight into his engine. I put the car directly on the heavy 2-post lift. I didn't plug a computer into the dashboard. I didn't pull a single spark plug out of the heavy aluminum cylinder head. I manually hooked a heavy mechanical pressure gauge directly to the high-pressure fuel line under the hood. The needle was violently bouncing all over the place. The physical pressure was totally unstable. The mechanical high-pressure fuel pump bolted directly to the top of the cylinder head was violently starving for raw fluid. I physically pulled the fuel rail, popped the expensive direct injectors out of the block, and the microscopic metal screens inside the injector bodies were heavily restricted with thick, contaminated sludge. I took a physical fluid sample directly out of his plastic gas tank in a totally clear glass jar. You could physically see the heavy, cloudy layer of separated water and acidic ethanol sitting directly on the absolute bottom of the glass. The actual octane rating of the remaining liquid gasoline sitting on top had completely crashed. The heavily boosted engine physically detected the massive, violent knock event from the low-octane fuel trying to detonate early, and the computer actively shut the raw power down to aggressively keep the heavy steel pistons from completely melting into the oil pan. To properly fix that massive chemical mess, we had to physically drop the entire heavy plastic fuel tank entirely out from under the chassis to scrub the inside completely clean. We had to physically replace the heavily scored mechanical high-pressure fuel pump. We had to ultrasonically clean all 4 of his expensive direct injectors and heavily flush the entire massive length of the steel fuel lines running under the car. I handed him a repair bill for exactly $3,200. Over $3,000 of raw, out-of-pocket financial damage entirely caused by a single, perfectly normal-looking gas station that silently let their underground tank completely degrade. The root cause wasn't a bad German engine, it was heavy fuel degradation inside a completely neglected storage tank. Now, you might be sitting there right now thinking, well, I don't drive a highly strung, expensive European turbo car. I drive a completely basic, highly reliable commuter car. My car can totally handle cheap, dirty gas. Let me completely stop you right there, because the exact same chemical rot violently happens to basic commuter cars every single day, it just hides significantly better. I had a completely different customer bring in a 2017 Toyota Corolla. A few weeks after that, Audi rolled out. It is the absolute definition of a totally reliable, completely bulletproof daily driver. He didn't have a flashing check engine light. He didn't lose total mechanical power merging onto the highway. He just had a very slight, incredibly annoying, rough idle when he was sitting at a basic red light. The steering wheel just vibrated a little too heavily in his hands. He totally ignored it for 6 solid weeks. He actively assumed the heavy metal block was just getting old, so he went to the local auto parts store, bought a totally useless $12 bottle of Magic Fuel Injector Cleaner, and dumped it entirely into his tank, heavily hoping for a totally cheap, magical fix. You cannot fix heavily separated fuel and active chemical contamination with a cheap plastic bottle of generic solvent. You are actively pouring your hard-earned money straight into the garbage. Eventually, his total fuel economy fell completely off a cliff. He went from easily getting 32 miles to the gallon on the highway down to barely hitting 24. Finally, a hard orange check engine light popped up for a massive catalytic converter efficiency code. When I finally got his car in the bay and dug entirely into the heavy live data on the professional computer scanner, I saw exactly what the engine was actively fighting. He was getting a mild, but totally consistent, heavy flow of contaminated, phase-separated fuel. It wasn't enough raw water to instantly stall the engine entirely like the Audi, but it was heavily disrupting the perfect microscopic spray pattern of his standard port fuel injectors. The liquid fuel wasn't atomizing into a highly combustible fine mist. It was aggressively dripping raw, heavy liquid straight onto his hot intake valves. He was getting long-term, highly destructive, completely incomplete combustion. Because the engine wasn't totally burning the heavy contaminated fuel mixture, it was violently dumping raw, unburned liquid hydrocarbons straight down the heavy metal exhaust pipe directly into his heavily expensive catalytic converter. The extreme raw heat of that liquid fuel actively burning inside the exhaust physically melted the highly sensitive internal ceramic honeycomb structure of the converter. The entire exhaust system totally plugged up solid. He was staring directly at a massive, totally mandatory $2,100 repair bill. $2,000 pulled directly out of his wallet for a heavy mechanical failure that started entirely as a totally invisible fuel problem. The absolute most dangerous part about his highly specific situation wasn't the total financial cost. It was the absolute fact that it never actually felt like an urgent, massive problem until the heavy metal and ceramics were already totally destroyed. You have to deeply understand exactly how your specific engine architecture physically reacts to this heavy chemical imbalance. They do not all fight this totally invisible battle the exact same way. If you drive a standard port-injected engine, like that Toyota Corolla or an older, naturally aspirated heavy truck, the mechanical system is initially significantly more tolerant of the abuse. The fuel injectors operate at a much lower raw physical pressure, maybe sitting around 50 or 60 psi. They will actively try to forcefully pass the heavy water and degraded ethanol mixture. The engine will just run incredibly rough, actively shake at an idle, and totally destroy your physical fuel economy long before it actively snaps a hard metal component in half. But if you drive absolutely anything with modern direct injection, which is practically every single car actively rolling off the dealership lot in the last 10 years, you are physically operating in a totally different mechanical danger zone. Those highly engineered systems rely entirely on heavy, pinpoint hydraulic pressure, easily hitting 2,000 or 3,000 raw psi. The microscopic tolerances inside that high-pressure pump and the heavy direct injectors are completely unforgiving. That high-pressure pump is actively driven directly by a heavy steel lobe on your spinning metal camshaft. When it violently starves for raw liquid lubrication because you fed it separated water, it doesn't just permanently damage the internal pump plungers. The intense, violent mechanical resistance can physically score the highly expensive camshaft itself, instantly turning a standard fuel system job into a massive, heavily invasive engine block teardown. The absolute second they lose raw lubrication from the fuel, the heavy metal tears itself completely apart and violently sends microscopic metal shrapnel completely through the entire fuel rail. You are staring directly at thousands of dollars in heavy replacement parts instantly. And if you physically bolt a turbocharger onto that exact same direct injected block, you are actively begging for a massive, catastrophic failure if you feed it highly compromised fluid. Turbos naturally generate massive, intense raw heat and extreme cylinder pressures. they heavily demand absolutely perfect, highly stable, high-octane combustion. When you introduce a totally degraded, low-octane layer of phase-separated fuel into a heavily boosted cylinder, the air and fuel mixture violently explodes entirely on its own, completely out of time with the heavy spark plug. It hits the rising, heavy steel piston like a massive, violent sledgehammer. It will literally shatter a hard piston ringland into heavy pieces of totally useless scrap metal in a fraction of a second. Even older engines, the heavy iron blocks built back in the 90s and early 2000s, are not completely immune. They might be slightly more forgiving of bad, low-octane fuel in the short term, but they still actively rot entirely from the inside out. The heavy acidic water completely attacks the raw steel inside their older metal fuel tanks, violently rusting the heavy tank from the inside and actively clogging the entire fuel delivery system with heavy, abrasive red sludge. I want to hear exactly what you guys have personally dealt with in your own daily drivers. Have you ever totally filled your tank at a totally random gas station on a road trip and barely made it a single mile down the road before the heavy engine started violently choking, shaking, and bucking? Did you instantly know it was the fuel, or did you heavily spend money trying to fix completely random ignition parts in your driveway? Drop a quick comment down below and tell me exactly what the absolute worst tank of gas you ever bought actually felt like behind the steering wheel. I read through every single one of those stories, and I guarantee you someone else watching this specific breakdown right now is actively dealing with the exact same violent hesitation you went through. This brings us directly to the absolute worst advice you hear repeated constantly by guys who think they know exactly how to protect their engine. When drivers finally realize this invisible chemical breakdown is actively happening, they immediately run to the internet forums or listen to a totally misinformed guy at the local auto parts store. And they start making completely illogical decisions that actually accelerate the physical destruction of their fuel system. The absolute biggest trap drivers fall into is the premium fuel myth. A guy thinks that simply by pressing the highly expensive 93-octane button on the pump, he is totally bulletproofing his engine. He thinks because it costs $1.50 more per gallon, it is magically immune to moisture and chemical separation. You have to completely understand the raw economics of a standard gas station. What percentage of drivers actively pull up and pay a massive premium for high-octane fuel? Maybe 10 or 15%. The vast majority of people are swiping their cards for standard 87 octane. That means the massive underground tank holding the premium fuel is sitting totally stagnant for weeks, sometimes months, completely undisturbed. While the cheap 87-octane tank is being rapidly emptied and refilled every 2 days with totally fresh fuel, that expensive 93-octane is just sitting in the dark, aggressively absorbing heavy moisture from the totally humid air every single night. The ethanol is violently pulling water into the mix. When you confidently pump that expensive premium into your car, you are actively paying a massive financial penalty for heavily degraded, completely stale fluid that is already dangerously close to phase separation. Premium fuel is entirely useless if the liquid is a month old. You absolutely have to prioritize station turnover over completely arbitrary brand loyalty or octane numbers. You want to buy your fuel from the exact same station where the heavy commercial work trucks and the landscapers are actively lined up every single morning. A high-volume station is physically cycling thousands of gallons of raw fluid every 48 hours. The heavy fuel never gets a chance to physically sit long enough to heavily absorb water and chemically separate. But there is a massive, highly specific exception to that rule, and it happens right in front of your face. You pull into a busy gas station, and you see the massive 18-wheeler fuel tanker truck totally parked over the underground access ports. The driver is actively dropping 10,000 gallons of fresh gasoline into the ground. Most guys look at that and think, "Perfect, I am getting the absolute freshest fuel possible." They pull up to the pump, swipe their card, and instantly initiate a massive mechanical nightmare. Look at the absolute bottom of those heavy underground tanks. Over years of commercial use, the absolute dead bottom of the tank becomes a massive, highly concentrated graveyard of heavy brown sediment, microscopic rust particles, and a thick layer of raw water. When the fuel sits completely still, that heavy garbage stays safely at the bottom. But when the massive delivery truck violently drops thousands of gallons of new fuel down a heavy metal pipe at extreme pressure, it totally stirs the entire tank up. It violently aggressively mixes that heavy, toxic graveyard directly into the clean fuel above it. The station pumps have microscopic paper filters hidden inside the metal cabinets, but when they get violently overwhelmed by totally agitated sediment, the heavy bypass valve kicks open. You are actively pumping a highly abrasive, heavily contaminated mixture of raw dirt and water straight into your car. If you ever see the heavy tanker truck dropping fuel, you put your car in drive and you immediately go to a totally different station. You never pump violently agitated fuel. And this leads entirely into how you physically operate the machine sitting in your own driveway. You have to totally abandon the habit of driving your car right down to the absolute bottom of the fuel tank. The low fuel light turns bright orange on the dashboard, the digital range says you have 12 miles left, and you just keep driving. Beyond the fact that you are actively starving your expensive electric fuel pump of the physical liquid coolant it totally needs to keep from violently superheating and melting its internal copper windings, you are mathematically setting yourself up for a massive contamination failure. Think about the raw volume. If you pull into a totally unknown station completely on empty, and you pump 15 gallons of heavily separated, bad fuel into your tank, your engine is instantly drinking 100% highly toxic poison. The engine completely suffocates and violently misfires before you even hit the highway on-ramp. But if you strictly execute the quarter tank rule, the physical math totally changes. If you have 4 or 5 gallons of highly stable, known good fuel already sitting entirely in your tank, and you accidentally pump in a slightly bad batch, you actively, heavily dilute the contamination. You give the heavy metal engine a fighting chance to physically pass the degraded fluid without instantly melting the ceramic core of your catalytic converter. Keep the tank above a quarter full. It is the cheapest insurance policy you can possibly buy for your fuel system. And if you think dumping a massive bottle of magic fuel additive into the tank every week is going to save you, you completely misunderstand the chemistry. Additives and fuel stabilizers are heavily engineered to completely prevent a chemical breakdown before it starts. They physically coat the fuel molecules to actively repel raw moisture. But if the fuel in the underground tank is already totally separated, or your car is already heavily hesitating and violently misfiring, the additive does absolutely nothing. You cannot chemically reverse phase separation. Once the heavy water and ethanol totally break apart, no cheap plastic bottle from the auto parts store is going to magically glue them back together. You are actively pouring $20 straight into the garbage. Because fuel quality is totally dynamic. It is completely invisible, and it physically changes based on the exact temperature and the heavy humidity outside your window right now. The exact same station that gave you perfect, high-performing fuel on a dry, freezing Monday morning can actively pump a heavily degraded, waterlogged mess on a totally humid Friday afternoon, right after a massive thunderstorm. And moisture isn't even the only totally invisible variable actively destroying your engine's efficiency. You have to physically understand fuel volatility. Gasoline is heavily composed of both light and heavy hydrocarbon chains. The highly engineered light chains are incredibly volatile. They physically evaporate extremely fast. That is exactly what allows a freezing cold engine to instantly start when you twist the key on a 30-degree morning. But as fuel sits stagnant, whether it is baking inside a massive underground tank in the brutal heat of summer, or actively sitting in your own plastic gas tank for 3 weeks because you barely drive the car, those highly critical light components totally evaporate right into the atmosphere. The heavy liquid left behind completely changes its physical mass. The fuel actually becomes heavily dense. When your expensive direct injectors aggressively fire that heavy, totally stale fluid into the combustion chamber, it absolutely refuses to atomize properly. Instead of a totally perfect, highly explosive, invisible mist, it violently shoots heavy liquid droplets directly onto the top of the pistons. The highly sensitive computer totally loses its mind trying to constantly alter the exact air-to-fuel ratio to compensate for the heavy liquid. The raw mechanical efficiency totally collapses. The average guy blindly optimizes entirely for price. He drives an extra 5 miles out of his way, totally out of his normal commute, to save 3 pennies a gallon at a completely dead, totally neglected rural gas station. He completely ignores the heavy rust on the physical pump handles and the fact that the actual flow rate is violently slow because the internal station filters are totally packed solid with heavy water and mud. He proudly thinks he just totally beat the system and saved himself $2.50 on a total fill-up. 6 months later, he is aggressively staring at a massive, totally mandatory $3,000 repair bill. His heavy metal high-pressure fuel pump is completely scored, his direct injectors are totally bricked with hard carbon and rust, and his car barely holds a basic idle. He actively traded $2 of upfront savings for thousands of dollars in violent, entirely avoidable mechanical damage. Fuel is no longer a totally generic, highly stable commodity that you can completely ignore. It is a highly volatile, completely unstable chemical system that heavily depends on physical storage conditions, aggressive station maintenance, and your exact daily habits. Your heavy metal engine does not fail randomly. It actively fails because of hundreds of small, entirely silent decisions. It fails because you treat fueling up like a totally mindless chore instead of a highly critical mechanical input. The heavy, steel components sitting under your hood completely do not care what highly expensive marketing logo is glowing brightly on the massive sign by the highway. The metal only reacts to the exact chemical reality of the liquid you forcefully pump into the tank. Stop blindly gambling with your own money, completely change exactly how you look at the pump, and I will see you in the next one.